I'm not.
Yeah, so again, we're starting with page 941.
Okay.
And that is, as I said, chapter 30, verse 1.
Okay.
So we are going to talk today about vows, right? And various kinds of vows and limitations on vows and things. Now, people don't generally make vows today, at least in the technical sense that the Torah and the Talmud talk about vows. A vow is a solemn promise to God or invoking God's name in making this promise. Just give me a second, everybody. Sandy, thanks for reminding me about the speaker view. So a vow is a solemn promise invoking God's name to do something or not to do something, or as a way of affirming that what you say is true. And we're most familiar with the last kind when we think about a legal proceeding, right? Do you solemnly swear that the words that you were about to say are the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth? I don't know if people use that language today, but certainly it's what we are familiar with, going all the way back, I think, for those who are of a certain age, to Perry Mason on television. At any rate, so there are a variety of reasons to swear vows. And the most important thing I want to say is that the Torah views vows as enormously important, and the obligation to keep them once one has stated them is almost absolute. You have to keep them. God does not forgive you for not keeping them, right? There is a sense in Judaism in general that speech is enormously important. There is no such thing as mere words, right? And I would remind you that in some ways this comes from, the idea that how God creates the world, right? God creates the world through speech, says words. Now, what it means to say God speaks and words in that context is completely unclear. But at least in human language, we're told that God spoke, right? We even say this as part of our prayers in the morning, Baruch Shamar v'haya holam. Blessed be the one who spoke and the world was brought into being, right? So that means that speech has power. Speech creates a reality, right? Obviously, when we speak words, we don't create a world. But in some sense, our words are more, the old saying, sticks and stones can break my bones, words can't harm me. The Jewish tradition deeply, deeply rejects that idea. Words are powerful. The rabbis tell us that, speaking lashon hara, speaking ill of someone, is like committing murder. Now, that's a hyperbole, of course. But it's a way of saying this is one of the worst things you could do, that it's not merely just words. So speech is critical, important, and nowhere more so perhaps than in this situation of vows. And we have, in some ways, you could say, 2 of the 10 commandments. Don't swear falsely, don't take my name in vain, really can be understood in the context of vows, vowing. One more thing, I mean, there's this terrible story in the book of Judges about a man named Yiftach, who is one of the military leaders of Israel, which is what the judges were by and large, and who swears an oath to God that if God gives him success in battle, he will sacrifice to God the first thing that comes out of the door of his house when he returns. And unfortunately, that is his daughter. And though the text is a little bit ambiguous, it's fairly clear that he perhaps sacrifices her, which is horrific and extreme and condemned. Not only the Torah seems uncomfortable with it in the way it tells the story and what it reflects about the character of Yiftach, but nonetheless, I think it's fair to say that it's an example of how seriously the Torah takes vows. So, as I said, one of the purposes of vows is swearing something to attest that a statement is true. And I wanted to share my screen now with you and look at a piece of the Mishnah. So this comes from the Talmud in a section called Baba Mitzia, which describes, at least at its beginning, some laws about found objects. So a little bit of context here. The general rule about found objects, if you find an object in the street, you have an obligation to return it to its owner. And that's a very strong obligation. It comes to us from the Torah itself. And in fact, you have to advertise that you've found it. You have to, if it's an animal, you have to care for it and feed it until the owner can be found. And then it's surrendered to the owner. In the case of the animal, the owner has to compensate you for the monetary expense of keeping the animal. In general, there is no such thing as, finders, keepers, losers, reapers, right? It doesn't, it is, you find it, you have to return it, but there is one exception, and it's a large one. And that is if there would be no way for the owner to prove that this object belonged to them. Right? It has the term in the Talmud is simanim. A siman is a sign, a way of describing something, which means that it's not, it's somewhat unique and can be identified. So to give you an example of something that does not have a siman, you're walking down the street and lo and behold, you find a $20 bill, right? Nothing, just a $20 bill. It's yours. You can keep it because there'd be no way for the owner to identify that $20 bill which they lost. On the other hand, if you were to find a wallet that had a $20 bill in it, and the wallet was distinctive enough that if someone said, hey, I was walking on such and such a street and I lost my wallet, and you say, well, what did your wallet look like? And they can say, well, it's a bifold and it's tan, and that combined with where it was found means you would have to return it, right? You'd be obligated to return it. And as long as it's distinctive enough, you need to advertise and find the owner, right? So, because the underlying legal theory is that someone who loses something with no identifiable marks in some ways gives up ownership because they have what's called yeush. And what yeush means, no expectation of return, and therefore they act as though it's not theirs anymore. They're not even going to bother to try to find it or to contact anyone or to go to the police or whatever it is, because they simply have no reason to believe that they could identify it to anyone's satisfaction. Okay, so all that's background to this Mishnah, and let's look for a minute at the Mishnah. Shnayin ochazin b'tali. So, so two people come into a court holding on to a talit. Now, a talit here is any kind of garment. or even a bolt of cloth. If you think about what is a talit, what we call a tallis today, it's really a four-cornered bolt of cloth that happens to have these fringes on the corner, right? But what the Mishnah here is talking about is not a talit in that sense of a prayer shawl, but just any four-cornered piece, garment, or piece of cloth. Now, each of them is going to say, I found it, right? Presumably, they both saw it and ran and grabbed it. And one thinks that he got it first, and the other one thinks that he got it first. So one of them says, hey, it's mine, I found it, and it's mine. The other one says, no, I was there first, and I found it, it's mine. But both of them are holding on to it. Both of them, no one is relinquishing his claim. So, and both of them say they found all of it. So, what do the rabbis say? This one, or each of them really swears, right? Does an oath, and that's why I'm bringing this to you, that I am not entitled to less than a half, right? It's an odd oath if you think about it. Like one swears it, and then the other swears it. Now, you would expect, perhaps, that they'd each have to swear that it was theirs, because that's what they go to court to say, right? This swears that it's all mine, this swears that it's all mine, because that's what they said, right? So that's what you would expect. But the rabbis don't say that. They say, this one says, I'm entitled to at least half. And this one says, I'm entitled to at least half, right? I have at least half, an entitlement to half. So why should that be? And the answer is that if both of them swear in oath that they are solemn oath before God, that I am entitled to all of it, then one of them is swearing a false oath. Right? One of them, even though it's what he believes, we'll give him the benefit of the doubt, even though it's what he believes, right? Somebody is not telling the truth. Or there isn't any validity to his words, right? And the rabbis want to avoid that at all costs. So even though he claims all of it, what he's really saying is, I'm entitled to at least half. And then what do? They divide it in half, since neither one can prove his claim. And just parenthetically, I would add that if it is an object that can't be divided, I mean, cloth is easy, you cut it down the middle. But let's say two people come and they found something that can't be divided, then the answer is that they sell it and they split the proceeds. All right. So here again, I just bring this to you to show you that oaths are an extremely serious thing, and the rabbis go out of their way, as the Torah does, to avoid a false oath. I want to go on just because I love this, to give you the next case, and then we'll leave this. So this one says, it's all mine, and this one says, it's half mine. In other words, one of them claims, I got there first, and the other one says, no, we got there at the same time. Makes a more modest claim. So how is it going to be divided? Surprisingly, the way it's divided is that the one who says it's all mine gets 3/4, and the one who says it's half mine gets 1/4.
I knew that was coming.
The logic here is this. Really, they're only fighting over half of the object. The one who says it's half mine acknowledges that half belongs to the other one, and the one who says it's all mine claims that it belongs to him. So that gets set aside, and now you have really the first case again. two people claiming about this half that it's all mine, so you split it. And here too, they offer a similar kind of vow. I'm going to, let me leave the share now. And I'm going to also come back to the gallery view, because I want to give you a chance, if you want, to ask a question. But I also want to make another point, and that is this. You could say, if vows are so fraught, and we're so concerned about someone not lying or inadvertently stating something under oath that's not true, why make them swear at all? Right? Why do that? Why get yourself involved in this potential for someone using God's name in vain or profaning God's name, or however you want to understand? And the answer is that the rabbis are also concerned about justice. And this is a way, if someone is making a false claim, I'm going to say, I absolutely got there first. And they're going to say, well, swear to it. Swear that you're entitled to at least half, right? At that point, a person might say, well, I thought I got there first, but I can't be absolutely sure. In other words, this is a way of discouraging overreach in terms of a claim. Okay, so that is a case of a vow instituted by a court so that someone would swear in terms of the truth of their words. Any question about that text at all? Sandy, go ahead.
If I could just say a few things. Is it true that when a Jew goes to like a court, like, a courthouse, and they're on a jury or something, that they say affirm and not swear?
Yes, and that is generally true. And rather saying, I solemnly swear before Almighty God, right? That looks very much like an oath. And we don't want to get involved in oaths if we don't have to. We say it's against my religion to swear an oath that I saw such and such or heard such and such, because really human beings are fallible, right? In fact, we now know that people's testimony doesn't always, even when it's sincere, their testimony isn't always accurate. So, right. So rather than say, I solemnly swear, observant Jews generally will say, I affirm, right? And they won't go quite that far. Sandy, you had another part to this?
Thank you. So is it correct? I just want to make sure I understand. An oath must be said out loud. Is that correct?
Yes. An oath is.
Just think it.
Yes, an oath is it has to be in some sense a public declaration. It isn't like you think, because remember that this is about the power of words, right? And words can't be thought. Even though we say, well, we think in words, really, when we talk about words, you can think, for example, if we talk about Lashon Hara, you can think, that guy is a horrible person who cheats everybody. And there's a big difference between that and saying it out loud where someone could hear it, right? So yes, it has to be spoken.
Thank you.
Sure. I thought, Saul.
Yeah, I had a question, because in the Hertz, it says something about sacredness of vows. It says the word neder denotes a solemn promise to consecrate something to God or do something in his service or in his honor. I'm just thinking, if somebody wants to become a Nazir, they don't necessarily have to say that, but is it implied that they're taking an oath?
No, Nazir is definitely a vow.
Oh, okay.
It's a neder, and I think that is actually in the language. Let me just go back. It's in Naso. Yes. If you look back, if you have the chapter 6 of the book of Numbers, right? The Lord spoke to Moses saying, speak to the Israelites and say to them, if anyone, a man or a woman, explicitly utters a Nazirite's vow, right? And the Hebrew is lindor neder nazir. Neder is a vow. So yes, it's not only, it's really quite explicit. And that's one of the problems with the Nazirite vow, because you really can't do certain, like you're not allowed to have contact with the dead, right? So what happens if you do, or what happens if there's a funeral, you have to avoid it. But if it is a funeral for, your father, then you have an obligation to go. And then your Nazirite vow starts all over again from the beginning, right? So in fact, this is a good example of a vow and the consequences of it. Thanks for raising it. Anything else about either the text or vows? So here's the last thing. I think the thing that most Jews think about when they think about vows is kol nidre, right? And in fact, if you look at the language here in Hebrew, right, it says ish ki yidor neder, kol nidre, a neder, Ladonai, hishava shvuah, or swears a shavua, right? Kol nidre, vesarei, v'shvueh, right? These are the words that we see, right? So kol nidre is a way, precisely because vows are so important, right? And the words matter. If one utters a vow which one cannot keep, right? And you're just not in the position to do so, what do you do, right? And so this is a way of officially, and it was controversial, and there were people, religious figures who strongly opposed it. And there were thoughts that it came out during a period of persecution, as you probably know, where Jews on pain of death were forced to swear things in terms of an allegiance to another God, right? So what do? They save their lives, and now they're living with this vow that they made. All of that, right, emphasizes the significance of vows. There is also in rabbinic tradition a way of nullifying vows. The rabbis struggle with this. In the Torah itself, with the exception of a parent or a husband, you can't nullify a vow. You have to keep it done. And I gave the example of Yitzchak and his daughter before. The rabbis want to limit that, as the rabbis want to limit lots of things in the Torah. And so they allow for a person who can come before a Beit Din tribunal, and the tribunal can release them from their vow. It's not here. It's not in the Torah. It is paradoxically because they think vows are so important. They need a remedy to, and you have to go and you have to collect the rabbis, and it's not just three. So it's not easy. There's a high bar, but there is, at least for the rabbis, a way of dealing with this. Okay. Particularly when you're simply incapable of keeping the vow. Let's assume, just to give you an example of that, let's assume that you make a vow. In biblical times, you make a vow to the temple. I will give X, or you could say, we don't tend to vow, we tend to pledge, right? It's a little smaller. I pledge $1,000 to the synagogue, which, by the way, I encourage. But I pledge $1,000 to the synagogue, to the rabbi's fund. I'll really encourage that. I don't have it anymore, but okay, I pledge, right? And then, the stock market crashes and you don't have a way to fulfill that vow. You simply can't do it, right? But you made a vow, not a pledge, a vow, right? What do you do? So the Talmud, the rabbis, need to create a remedy, and they do. Okay, so what kinds of vows do we have? In addition to swearing an oath, right, that your testimony is correct, or that so-and-so owes you money, right? He says, I don't owe it. I say you do owe it, right? Swearing an oath that what you say is true because there's no document available, right? In addition to that kind of vow, you could make, as I said, a pledge to the temple. You might vow yourself, right? And what that meant is the monetary worth that you have. They didn't have actuarial tables in those days, right? You couldn't say, well, this human being's life is worth X or Y, right? Which we do have in our society when we try to calculate, somebody is killed and how do we figure out what their lost earnings would be and all of that kind of thing, right? But there was a sense one could value, the Torah itself gives certain measures. And there was also a sense, if this person were sold into slavery, what would, because slavery is real in the time of the rabbis, so what would their service be worth? So you could make that kind of vow, a vow to the temple, or you could vow a certain amount of money to the temple, and that would be another form of vow. And then there's a final form of vow, maybe there are more, but this is the other one that occurs to me. And this is a vow that you make to deny yourself something. This is not something we see very often. It used to be that Catholics had this vow. During the period of Lent, I will not do this. I won't eat this, or I won't go to the theater, because as a kind of penance, right? And I don't know that they use the language of vowing, but that is, I used to think, I contemplated, but never did, precisely because of the power of vows and the possibility of not keeping them. I once thought that this was the ultimate dietary advice. You want to lose weight? Make a vow, I will not eat carbs. Right? I won't eat them. As a promise, solemn statement before God. But that's just, it's not worth it. So anyway, right? But there are vows which people would make. And there's a classic vow, and it's interesting because it'll show you that the rabbis make an exception to what we're about to read. What if a wife vows that she will not sleep with her husband?
Wow.
I'm done. As God is my witness, that's it. So the rabbis say that he has to divorce her. He has to pay her ketubah, at least after a while, right? Why? Because in their view, a sexless marriage by choice is not really a marriage. They view intimacy as critical to marriage. Now, there are times, obviously, when for one reason or another, people are not able to have sex. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the choice. But the classic example of self-denial is the Nazarite vow. Saul brought up before, right? I will not cut my hair. I will not have contact with the bed. I will not drink wine or intoxicants, right? It's a vow. So that sort of gives you a sense of vows, the different kinds of vows, how important vows are. And now we're going to see a limitation, and a major one, and one which I think to most of us in modern times doesn't seem quite right. So if a man makes a vow to the Lord or takes an oath imposing an obligation, on himself, he shall not break his pledge. He must carry out all that has crossed his lips. However, if a woman makes a vow to the Lord or assumes an obligation while still in her father's household by reason of her youth, and her father learns of her vow or her self-imposed obligation and offers no objection, her vow shall stand. But if her father restrains her on the day that he finds out, none of her vows or self-imposed obligations shall stand, and the Lord will forgive her since her father restrained her, right? So you have a daughter and she makes a vow, right? You hear about it and you say, no way, right? Her vow doesn't stand. You can annul it. It no longer has a consequence, and God will forgive her because this was outside her power. So this really, since many vows entail money, right? In one way, she is a member of the household, and if she vows something, essentially he has to pay it, right? Because she doesn't have income. Right? And as a result, she is making a vow for him and for his finances. And therefore, I think, it's not the only kind of vow she can make. It is perhaps the most common kind of vow. Under those circumstances, there's a window of opportunity, right? When he hears about it immediately, but once then the next day comes, if he has not objected, he can't change his mind. So the rabbis love to limit things. They're troubled by this because, first of all, it's God's word. You know, you've given your word, but they also don't really feel comfortable with vows being annulled, even under these circumstances. And so they pick up on the word, in English, it's by reason of her youth. And in Hebrew, it is, where is it? B'ni'ureha, right? In her youth. And the rabbis make a very clever argument, and they say the following. Well, what does it mean in her youth? If she was a child, right, then she's not, it's a technical term. It doesn't apply to children, right? But if she's an adult, it really doesn't apply to her anyway. So what is this? This is from 11 and a half to 12. Right? Half a year, right? Because a girl becomes a legal adult when she's 12, right? And she's still a child when she is 11. So so now the rabbis are saying, first of all, he has to do it within a day. And second of all, he has to do it, when she's a preteen, right? There's that window of opportunity, right? We're going to see this in the second case also. By the way, this is one of the things that the rabbis do the same thing with the stubborn and rebellious child in the book of Exodus. It says if a child is stubborn and rebellious, he gets brought to the judges, and if it's all proved true, he could be executed. So the rabbis don't like this at all, and they say, well, what's a child? What's a stubborn and rebellious child? Well, if he's really a child, then the laws didn't apply to him anyway, so what he did wasn't a sin, and if he's an adult, then he's not a child. So in the case of a boy, 12 and a half to 13. And that's just one of many ways in which they try to eliminate that law. And finally, we get a statement that there never was and never will be a stubborn and rebellious child. He's a drunkard and a glutton, but he has to drink enormous amounts of wine and eat huge amounts of meat. He doesn't listen to the voice of his father and his mother. The word voice in the Torah is singular. So it's not voices, but voice. So what does that mean? His father and his mother's voice have to sound exactly the same. Her voice is higher, his voice is lower, doesn't apply, and so on. So, right, there have to be witnesses, all kinds of things, right? So here too, the rabbis, simply by limiting what did it mean in her youth, the rabbis are putting the brakes on here. But that's not the only case. So let's look at the other case also. And that is if the woman should marry while her vow or commitment to which she bound her is still in force, and her husband learns of it and offers no objection on the day he finds out, her vows will stand and her self-imposed obligations will stand. But if her husband restrains her on the day he learns of it, and thereby annuls her vow, which is in force, or the commitment with which she bound herself, the Lord will forgive her. Okay, so this is similar to a child. Right? She made the vow, and she made it before he was married to her. And her father let it stand. What about the husband? Right? He finds out, wait a minute, she made this vow. I don't want that. I don't want to be married to someone who made this vow. I'm canceling it, right? And he has, according to the Torah, and I say the Torah because we're going to talk about the rabbis in a minute, but according to the Torah, he has the opportunity to cancel her vow. This probably also has to do with the fact that she's a part of the household and he is the economic determinant of the household, and most vows have financial consequences. By the way, now it goes on. What if she doesn't live in somebody else's household? The vow of a widow or a divorced woman, which she has imposed upon herself, is binding. So too, if when in her husband's household, she makes a vow or imposes an obligation on herself, her husband learns of it, thus failing to restrain her, all her vows shall stand, all her self-imposed obligations shall stand. But if her husband annuls it on the day he finds out, nothing that has crossed her lips shall stand. And her vows are annulled, and God will forgive her. Every vow, every sworn obligation of self-denial may be upheld by her husband or annulled by her husband. If her husband offers no objection, one day to the next, so uphold the vows and so on. If he annuls them after he finds out, he will bear the guilt. So if the day period has passed, and now he wants to annul them, it's as though he made a vow and didn't keep it. Right? So here too, there's a narrow window. So the rabbis are also bothered by this. And so what do they say, at least they're really bothered by the case of the father who didn't annul the vow, and now the husband has married her and he wants to annul it. Right? I think the rabbis think this is kind of double jeopardy. You know, her vow got judged. It was considered to be okay. And now, after the fact, maybe a year or two later, now the husband is going to object. So what the rabbis say is, this only applies in a circumstance where when she was betrothed, she made the vow, and her husband to be and her father, therefore, have a one-day window, both of them, to oppose the vow. And it's a simultaneous time period, as opposed to it not annulled by one, but it's annulled by the other. Okay, so much for vows. They do, however, allow to stand the vow that's made within the husband's after she's married. Right? And this is, a reflection. I don't think there's any way around it, of a patriarchal society where men are in charge. I wonder, and I don't know the answer to it. We do know, according to rabbinic law, that a woman who brings property into a marriage is entitled to keep her property. It's hers. After she gets married, let's assume she's a weaver, right? She's been a weaver, she sells her cloth, and it's her money. Now she gets married and she continues to weave, and the money goes to her husband. Why? Because he's in charge of the economics of the household, he's feeding her and clothing her and taking care of her, and the money therefore goes to him. But in the former case, I wonder whether she can make a vow about that money. I don't know the answer to it, but it just struck me. Okay, so we are going to move on to a subject which is really, oh, how did I manage to do that? All right.
I have a question before we go on.
Yeah, please.
So in modern day, when many couples are working and women have their own careers, this is not going to sit well with a lot of people.
No. And you're absolutely right. And in modern times, this is essentially a dead letter.
Oh,
right?
good.
Because Jews avoid vows, right? And it's precisely because vows really impose, there is no obligation outside of a rabbinic court. There's never an obligation to make a vow, right? So it's essentially a dead letter, and people are free. By the way, I should mention this because I think, well, if we talk about vows in our society, people making a vow, what comes to mind? Where do we make vows? Still.
Weddings.
Weddings.
I'm sorry?
Marriage.
Marriage vows, sure,
Marriage.
right? It sounds like a classic, and we call them vows. Jews don't make marriage vows. Traditionally, there are no marriage vows in a Jewish wedding. A wedding, and by the way, why is it that the Catholic Church is opposed to divorce, right? And has to go through this convoluted kind of nullification. They find a reason why the marriage wasn't really valid, right? They can annul it. Why? Because it's a vow. Because you've made a solemn promise to God till death do us part, right? Through sickness and health and all that, right? We don't do that.
Yeah.
We view marriage as a contract. We even have a ketubah, right?
Ketubah.
Which is a wedding contract, which specifies obligations of each party and what the financial payment would be in terms of a divorce, right? All of that, right? Because it's not a vow. And that, what does that mean? It means that divorce is perfectly legitimate.
And what about the, oh, sorry.
I would go further. Divorce doesn't carry a stigma in Judaism. There is a sense that a divorce is tragedy, but not wrong. There is a sense that when a couple gets divorced, there's a midrashic statement that God weeps over this. Not that God cries, but God weeps over this. There's something tragic about this couple that was in love or began, and the opportunities are ahead of them, and so on, and then it doesn't work out. But it's absolutely legitimate. There should be no stigma attached to being a divorcee or anything like that, right? Now, it's true, if you look in the modern Orthodox world, that in the more traditional Orthodox world, there is a bit of a stigma about divorce. A divorced person is considered less of a desirable candidate for marriage. But in theory, that should not be true. Francesca, were you going to say something?
Yes. So what about the place of the knipple?
The knipple.
Do you know about the knipple? My mother and I have been talking about that recently.
No, I don't know what a knipple is.
Okay, I'll tell you about the knipple. There's a really cute story about that because you knew my parents when we were growing up, or at least my mom, whenever Barbara had play dates and you were coming along to pick her up. So a knipple is maybe it's an Eastern European thing. I don't know other parts of the Jewish world that do this. It's basically a private stash So in case if your husband becomes a schnook, at least you still have something to fall back on that he doesn't know about.
Knippel, yes.
Knipple. So because my father apparently was horrified that my mother didn't have a knipple. So my father, who was always in love with my mother, decided to open up a bank account so that my mother could have her own
Wow.
knipple, which sort of when it gets what the whole thing is about. It's supposed to be a secret, but it's a very sweet story about how much in love my parents always
Right.
were with each other.
Okay. That's great. No, I have never heard that term.
Oh, good. I
Marie.
can teach
I
you some
heard of
also,
it.
Change. You
I
can teach
always-
us so much.
I always think of that as like these stories about stuff, the wives who used to stuff money in the under the mattress.
Yeah, yeah. You have that, you know, she's right, or she scrimps and he gives her money for food and allowance, and she scrimps and saves and
Right.
sets it
And it's a big
aside.
secret
Yeah,
for her
well,
own private.
you know, and this idea, so this idea of a woman wanting to be a free economic actor, it's my money, I will do with it as I please, right? You see this, I mean, this is in some ways a response to the kind of mindset that we see in the Torah and in this business about women's vows, right? He says, you know, you can't make that vow. And she says, it's my money. Right? It's not your money. It's my money. It's my knipple. Thank you for that word. Okay. Any other questions or comments? Because we're not gonna be able to move on. The next section, I find one of the most troubling in the Torah. It's the war against Midian. It's going to concern us. It is a brutal war, as you'll see, and really troubling. I'll say that, and we'll talk about it next time. Yeah, go ahead, Saul.
Yeah, this part about the vows, this doesn't apply to males, I guess, right?
What do you mean?
Well, if they make a vow,
Yes, but no one can nullify your vow biblically. As I mentioned, the rabbis do have a remedy.
Find a way.
Yes. I thought someone said something. Okay. So yeah, a guy in biblical terms doesn't get out of his vow. If, you know, one of the reasons, it just occurred to me, right? You might read into this that a boy could make a vow and it stands, right? We're talking about a girl in her youth, biblically, right? Her father gets to nullify it. Well, what about a boy? Right? And so I think the rabbi's analysis of how, you know, she's between 11 and a half and 12, it does come from somewhere. I never really thought about it before. But this idea that a child could make a vow that would stand, you know, doesn't make any sense, really. It really doesn't make any sense. It undermines, you know, how could, you know, your 4-year-old, you know, or even your 8-year-old says, well, I vowed, you know, to give my friend, you know, $10,000, right? And that's going to stand. And we don't even have the qualification that when his father hears about it and so on. So we can't be talking really about a child here. You really can't be talking about a child. Okay. Anything else? Okay. So yeah, go ahead. Saul.
in terms of the non-Jewish world, a marriage license is actually a contract, isn't it?
Yeah, that's what it said.
Sure it is. In the non-Jewish world, marriages can be absolved. The question is, you know, how does God feel about that? Right? And from the Catholic Church's point of view, you can get, this is actually true among Jews too, in a way, that you can go to court and you can get a divorce. The church will say you're still married, right? I mean, you know, this was a tremendous problem in England. This is why, this is why Henry had to, establish the Church of England, because the Pope wouldn't allow him to get a divorce. Now, he was the king. Civilly, he could do what he wanted to do, right? So Jewish law also doesn't recognize civil divorce, right? It's a contract, and you can dissolve it, but it's a contract under Jewish law, and therefore you need to dissolve it under Jewish law. That continues to be true for conservative Judaism and Orthodox Judaism. With respect to Reform Judaism, if a couple is married by the state essentially and divorced by the state. How we deal with couples where they get a civil divorce and there is no religious divorce because the husband is unwilling is a tremendously difficult problem. That which there are a variety of attempts to solve it. The conservative movement has essentially solved it. There are moves in the Orthodox community today, very controversial ones, to solve it. Among the lines, actually, that the conservative movement solved it long ago. I'll leave it at that because we really don't have time to talk about that. But I want to wish, go ahead, Hannah. Last comment.
Just a very technical little thing. Matot starts with 2. How come it doesn't start with 1? The first part of it, Matot, on that page starts with 2 and not 1. What happened to 1? Is that common that Parsha could start at any number? What happened to 1? I'm just wondering.
Thank you. Let me just see something before I answer you. No. So 1 is the last verse of the previous parsha, right? So if you go back to the beginning of chapter 30 on page 936, verse 1. So Moses spoke to the Israelites just as the Lord had commanded them. Now, why the parsha is divided? I know. This is a great question, Hannah. This is a great question. So the question is, when it says Moses spoke to the Israelites as the Lord had commanded them, does it refer to what was told to Moses before this, or does it refer to what is about to be told? In other words, the business about vows. The Christians who divided the text into chapter and verse clearly believe that it really referred, when it says Moses spoke these laws, it was what was about what had come before. So they put it, right? They think rather that it's about what's coming afterwards. So they put it at the beginning of chapter 30. The Jews who divided this into the weekly Torah portions must have believed that it referred, that Moses said these things referred to what came before it. Right? And so they left it at the end of Parshat Pinchas rather than putting it at the beginning of Parshat Matot. Thank you for pointing that out. It's fascinating. I don't think that there's a particular theological reason here why it would be on one chapter or another. It's simply the way they read scripture. Last comment, I know we're completely out of time. I did say that it's the Christians who gave us chapters and verses. The Jews had to adopt them because of disputations where Jews were forced to defend, right? There were these trials, these medieval trials where, where Jews were put on trial, and there were these questions about the meaning of scripture, and Jews were forced to answer, right? Accusations. And they would say things like, what do you think about Genesis chapter 25, verse 2? You got to know what Genesis 25, chapter 2 is. So we began to adapt these chapters and verses as our own. But originally, it was just the division into parshas, and this is not the only place that you see this. If you look at in Genesis chapter 2, let me turn to it. Chapter 1 is about the creation of the world, and chapter 2 begins with the heavens and the earth were completed, and on the seventh day, God created Shabbat, right? That is not, that is all included. The creation of Shabbat is included in the first Aliyah, even though it's chapter 2, because Jews did not want to separate Shabbat out from the rest of the week, right? They considered the creation of Shabbat part of creation. Anyway, not really important, but interesting, at least to me. Have a great week.
Thank you.
I hope.
Thank
Oh,
you.
one more thing. So as it happens in the synagogue I belong to now, I will be giving the sermon this Shabbat. Those services are actually available online. If you're interested in hearing me give a sermon, I will include a link to the synagogue service when I send out the recording. So if you're interested in coming to shul this Shabbos here at Congregation B'nai Shalom, you will hear me give a sermon. And if you're not, I'm not offended in any way.
How much longer will you be giving these classes? When do you stop for the summer?
Okay, so I'm not in, I used to stop with Shavuot. I haven't really decided when I'm going to take a break for the summer,
Okay.
but I will let you know, I promise.
Okay, thanks.
And not on the last class. All right, have a great week, everybody.
Thanks, you
Thank
too.
you so much,
Thank
Rob.